Good afternoon. Happy Black History Month from down here in Bessemer, Alabama. My name is Tammy Lee. I'm an assistant professor at Rutgers University in the Department of Labor Studies and Employment Relations. Our conversation today is going to hit on a couple of topics. There's 5 of us on the panel. We're going to talk about our career path in labor, activism, and academia, and the impact of activist scholars, right, on labor relations and labor policy. But we also want to hear from you. We've reserved some time at the end. We're going to have our colleague, Kate Griffith, come on and take us through a Q&A. So submit those in the chat, and we'll be fielding through them tonight. But let's go around quickly, just very, very briefly, in a minute or less, to the panel and have them all introduce themselves. And let's start with Fila.
Hi, everyone. My name is Fila Townsend, and wow, where do I start? So this is part of being, I think, an activist scholar, figuring out what hats. But currently, I am a PhD candidate at the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations. I am working on my dissertation, which looks at Black worker centers, specifically how race and class and gender structures have shaped the emergence of these organizations. As a researcher or scholar, I've looked at issues on a range of things. I'm particularly concerned about income and wealth inequality for workers, thinking about the future of workers, which I think is an important distinction than talking about the future of work. And I also am part of, I think, why I'm on this panel, engage in policy conversations, but particularly trying to sort of be at this intersection of policy, scholarship, and activism, and really trying to move forward conversations around workers and what it means to build power. So I'm really pleased to be a part of this amazing panel. I think there's, a lot that we're going to be able to talk about today. Oh, and I should mention, I also am a Cornell ILRE, class of 06. So again, really happy to be here and joining these amazing panelists. So thanks.
All right. Thank you, Fila. Naomi.
Hi, everyone. I'm also very excited to be here talking with friends and colleagues on this very important topic. My name is Naomi R. Williams. I use they, them pronouns. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Labor Studies at Rutgers and School of Management and Labor Relations. Got to get that all in there. And I'm also a historian of the working class in the United States.
Thank you, Naomi. Cherie.
Hi, everyone. Bringing you all greetings from the Center for Innovation and Worker Organization, where I'm the Associate Director. That center is based also in the School of Management and Labor Relations. I also co-direct a program, Will Empower. It's Women Innovating Labor Leadership. Looking forward to talking about that more later. And I'm also an assistant professor of professional practice in the department as well. And I'm really, really looking forward to having this conversation, have been for a very, very long time. So thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Cherie. Maite.
Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be on this panel. My name is Maite Tapia. I'm an associate professor at Michigan State University in the School of Human Resources and Labor Relations. I actually, together with Tammy, we did our PhD at Cornell ILR School. And currently, as Tammy mentioned in the beginning, we're actually in Bessemer, Alabama, as we're working with the union RWDSU, looking at Amazon's policing power and specifically using a racial lens. So looking forward to this conversation, and thank you all.
Thank you, Maite. And I'm Tammy Lee, like I said before. I am an industrial engineer, a labor lawyer, and now an academic. So I'm going to take you on quite the ride when we get there. I'm also the co-founder of a nonprofit called Haven, which creates a safe space for activists of color to talk about the things that we're facing and redefine things like liberation and talk about things like abolition. So I'm also very happy to be here. Also Cornell ILR, shout out, and representing the School of Labor, or the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers. So that's all of us. Kate's going to introduce herself on the Q&A, but we want to get into it because we want to make sure we have enough time to do Q&A. The first question that I'm going to pose to the panelists is a definitional one. What is activist scholar? Or what is an activist scholar? What does that mean to you as an identity? And then take us on your journey to how you got where you are. And just for the audience to know, sometimes we do these Zoom things and we all expect it to go in a certain format. All of us on this panel know each other very well, and we're in activist circles together, and we do circle work, which means we're going to go around and everyone's going to tell the story the way they like to tell the story. So if it's not your usual way of listening, I just, hold space for us and let us do this. So we're going to start with Fila. What is an activist scholar to you, Fila, and how'd you get here?
Thanks, Tammy. So I think being an activist scholar means to be able to operate at tensions. As I referenced earlier, it means wearing different hats, particularly the tensions that I want to talk about today. And I think, relevant to this panel are really what it means to be accountable to communities, first and foremost, that your work supports. And to do that through, I guess, a scholarly lens, or using scholarship as tools as part of your tool set. And I know we'll flesh this out on the panel, but I think, you're pulled in a number of different directions. So I think for me, and for different people, what it means to be an activist, what it means to be a scholar will manifest differently in your work. So for me, what that has meant, I think first has been, I'm always someone who is looking for answers to questions. So Cherie taught me this, but she says, I'm not just interested to look in and see. I think, a lot of research is often about, oh, these are interesting questions and I want to explore. And really it's, no, I want to look in and see and study and explore and examine and interrogate the thing, whatever it is, because I'm actually looking to develop solutions, right? And to work in community with folks to develop solutions. So I think for me, it's put me on quite a journey. I started out, as I said, ILR. And whenever I talk about myself, I frame it around like the domain of labor and employment, which is a big thing. It can mean different things, but, what it means coming out of Cornell as an undergrad, I first went into working in manufacturing as someone, I worked for management, but as someone right out of school, that was a lot to hold as a young Black woman right out of school, stepping into predominantly white machinist environment in aerospace was a lot to hold. Over the course of my career, I've been in the private sector. I've, been in grad school. I've had a business degree. I'm back, getting my PhD. And I think, a lot of people think, oh, well, there's so much school in that. But for me, at each point, it was really about feeling like as a society, there were just other questions we needed to answer, right? And I wanted to be in a position to answer those questions, but to hold the skills and the capabilities of what it means. So sure, we need to be in community with scholars and activists and researchers and policymakers and community organizers and all of these things ultimately to solve these complex issues. But I do think it means something to embody at least, a combination of those things. And so that I think is what has propelled me at different points in my career to want to go further, to want to go deeper into the issues. I'm sure this will come up, but all of us here are grounded in critical race theory. And what that means is the analysis that we bring to the work, how we understand the nature of the problem, how we go about solving the problem, who we work alongside to develop the problems with is a core part of our praxis as we approach our research and our activist work, however that may look. So I think, again, as I mentioned at the start, I'm at the hopefully tail end trying to finish my dissertation. I think everyone here on this panel knows what that's like. It's almost like it gets rougher when you're towards the end. But, for me, I even through this work as a PhD student have stayed connected in some sort of communities, which has meant I've had to hold a lot. I've had to hold a lot financially. I've had to hold a lot emotionally. But I think that's what it means to be an activist scholar, is to be able to hold these different tensions, because it's ultimately what I think allows you to approach the work in the way that you do. So I will stop there.
Well, I appreciate you. And by the way, I'm working with Fila and her studies, and you will make it. We are a village. So it's just a matter of time for that next phase. Naomi, can you help us continue to build? What is an activist scholar to you, and how did you come to be here with us?
I really like, Fila, the way you talked about the tension and holding that tension. And that kind of speaks to how I got here, right? And so when I first saw that question, what is an activist scholar? I'm like, oh, that's me. Right? I am an activist scholar. What that means right off the bat, right, in simple terms, is that my research agenda is about justice, is about helping working people achieve their goals. And so that's my answer, full stop. And then I'm going to go and tell you how I got here. And part of how I got here is what happened at university. I got to university and I was taking these classes, and the history I was learning, the political science I was learning, didn't match my lived experience. And there was a disconnect, a tension there. And I was like, well, how do I answer this? I found my answer in classes on labor history and in classes that were taught with a different perspective. So, for example, my work centers on life histories, and my main methodology is life history because I took a methodology course from a labor historian who used that model. And for the first time, I was reading scholarship that looked like my lived experience. I was able to see my community in Southern Louisiana in the stories that these people told across the South. And it opened doors and explained things to me in ways that I never expected. I knew that my lived experience was valid, right? I knew that coming in. And I also understood social structures and the ways, like through my history courses, the ways that explain the reason why the world looked the way it did. But in labor history, that is where I was able to see, oh, you know what? Working together collaboratively in community brings real results. And that for me just changed the trajectory of my career. Because at that point I was like, okay, this is the answer that I want to see. This is what made me want to keep going and keep doing this work. And then I went to graduate school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm going to claim it as the home of the whole field of employment relations and the home of the field of labor history. And to be there, and to, take seminars in the Commons Room, right? Go to the Commons Room and have seminars. And to be an active member of my union as a graduate student. And together, the environment, the history, to be able to have so many scholars who had been trained as labor historians, even if they didn't do labor history, in their professional careers, it coalesced into the path that I'm on, basically, to say that. And so I made a commitment very early to always center the voice of working people in my research. I'm sorry, go ahead, Tammy.
No, I'm sorry, Naomi, go ahead, please.
Right. So yeah, so I made that choice. That's what I do. Also, when I was in graduate school, I got involved with an activist organization. So I have been a member of the Labor Research and Action Network for 9.5 years, almost 10 years now. And it's been a place for me to grow. And my professional home, also in labor history, has been a place for me to grow, because labor history, just like the Labor Research and Action Network, LRAN, right? Those two organizations together are made up of activist scholars. And so to have that all around puts me in a very privileged position, right? Because the tension that Fila is experiencing now wasn't my experience once I got to graduate school. In graduate school, it was expected that I was to be an activist scholar. And that has really given me the strength to manage these tensions in different ways. And I'll stop there, Tammy.
Yeah, and I'm sorry that I cut you off there briefly. I think we're really going to come back to some of the things you've said, Naomi, especially about just saying out loud that my research agenda is about justice has consequences to it, right?
Right.
And to be able to scream out loud or to feel comfortable being an activist in your profession is also something that is different depending on what sector you came out of. So I hope to return to that on our second question. Cherie, help us keep building.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's important around identifying as an activist scholar, and I want to be clear that there are some folks who identify as scholar activists, right? For me, I identify as an activist scholar because activism has always been a part of my life, even when I didn't really have the words for it. I was the high school student who was like president of student council and almost got kicked out of school because I was passing out literature about Rodney King, right? I got to Spelman and really almost graduated without getting a sense of where I was supposed to go, because I was a psychology major, but it was kind of like I was doing the major because I'm smart and I'm supposed to do this thing and I care about people. But I was like, something doesn't jive, like this objective thing. I don't believe it, right? I don't believe that it's possible that some people just don't care what the outcomes are. And so I'm learning it and I can do it, but I don't feel ownership over it. And quite frankly, it was in my minor in political science where I wrote a paper about bell hooks and Frederick Douglass and, got to develop my own theory that I got walked to the women's studies department. And quite frankly, that's the place that I realized exactly where I was supposed to be. So I don't come to labor through being a worker, through being a worker leader, through any of the, I would say, typical pathways. I just became a union member within the last year, even though I've spent 20 years working in labor. I come to labor through Black feminism. I read Kim Crenshaw when I was a senior in college at Spelman, and pretty much read so many Black feminist scholars, Angela Davis, you name it. And that's exactly what they did. That was the only way, quite frankly, to do it. And so even when I went through women's studies, I was rooted in a Black feminist politic. I got involved with labor in grad school because there was a strike on my campus. And for me, this was a practical way to put the theoretical things that we were discussing in my women's studies program into action. And from there, my Black feminism took me into labor. And so I worked locally at the Ohio State Fed. I worked at the National AFL-CIO. But it was always this thread of what is happening with women of color in particular, and how do I center those narratives that was, giving me my North Star in terms of what the larger project is. And so to me, an activist scholar is somebody who is aware that there's a larger project. They're not just doing scholarship to kind of advance through the ranks to be able to say, I have a title. They're doing and moving to different places so that there are levers that can be pulled, that open doors, that open windows, that make very exclusive entities more inclusive and available, and also shift the way and the power dynamics and the resources that go into asking a different set of critical questions. And so when I think about right now in this moment, we're coming up with scholarship that solves challenges, long-standing challenges. We are picking up batons. We are part of a larger lineage. And that thing matters, because the reason why you can go to the Barnes and Noble or your local independent bookstore and pick up the 1619 project off the shelf is because a long line of activist scholars have been doing this work to make a new narrative available that helps all of us to see ourselves. And quite frankly, that's the work.
Right. Right. I hope we would return to this, and maybe the audience is just as intrigued as I am about what the difference is between an activist scholar and a scholar activist. And I've got some thoughts. I know you do, so maybe that'll come out later on. Maite, I want to invite you to join the circle and take us somewhere else, right? Maybe even global.
Thanks, Tammy. I mean, it's so impressive to hear, from Cherie and Naomi and Fila, your journeys. I mean, in comparison, like, for example, for me, I graduated, with a PhD in labor relations from Cornell, but I only read Crenshaw after I graduated my PhD. So there's definitely was something missing in a way there, right? So we always learned that, even though our field of industrial relations, it's, has a norm, it's normative, it's about solving this labor problem. At the same time, we kind of were taught, or at least that's how I saw it, that we needed to be objective and neutral, etc. Right? So I only kind of learned later on in my journey that there is no such thing as kind of neutral or objective scholarship, and that it's important to take a stand, and that I do have this belief, like Naomi also mentioned, this belief in justice, right? And that's where my research would drive me to. And so I do think, as kind of producers of knowledge, that we're kind of implicated in creating the reality. So we need to be take that seriously, and don't think that we can be neutral or objective in that way, but that we have to take a stand. And so that's, for me, why it becomes very important to kind of work with the organizations, such as now in Alabama, work with the RWDSU, etc. Work with the UAW where I live in Michigan. And like Naomi also mentions, centering the voices of the workers, right? Which is sometimes also often missing in where I came from. So I think I learned a lot through kind of my journey and hearing kind of how you all talk about it. I feel like I'm learning a lot, through what you say as well. And it resonates kind of with my how I kind of came through this process. So in essence, for me, scholar activism is about kind of, we all have this kind of deep-seated belief in social justice, and it's about taking a stand and doing that by working with organizations and advancing scholarship like that. And that way you then also kind of create kind of a better, hopefully, structured world around you, essentially.
Great. Thanks, Maite. I think I hear a universal theme going around here that, scholar activism has something to do with the political choice to show up the way that you show up in spaces. So for me, this is an interesting question, even though I wrote it, because there was a moment late in my professional career, in my second career as a labor lawyer, where I woke up in El Salvador sharing a room with a white lawyer. We were both members of the National Lawyers Guild, which is a well-known activist lawyer, guild or group in the United States. And we were there to observe the Salvadoran election in 2009. And I didn't know her. We woke up in the morning and she asked me how I became an activist. And I literally had never thought about that before, because the answer to that for me is to be born Black and be curious is that you are now an activist scholar, or to be born and want to be born Black and want to be free. You got to do a lot of research to figure out what is happening to you and how you can actually do this thing or get anywhere near this idea of meritocracy that sort of underlies some of the way in which we approach understanding capitalism in this country, right? So for me, I think I was just born into being an activist scholar. In terms of my professional journey, which I know a lot of my students are on the call and kind of want to hear this, but, you know, my first job was an industrial engineer, right? We're all here, all of us on this call are in support of workers' rights. And I can't think of one job that is more anti-workers' rights than industrial engineer. How did that happen? That happened because there's a crisis there was an absence of activist scholars in my life who taught me what do industrial engineers really do. I went into it because I wanted to design safe workplaces for workers. It's an ergonomics specialist. That sounds amazing. That's not what happens in practice. And I think that I learned at that moment that, you know, that 5 years I spent at engineering school at Northwestern, and no one ever told me that I would be responsible for the loss of jobs of so many Black workers in manufacturing. I wouldn't have done it. I wouldn't have made that career choice, right? So, you know, I go into industrial engineering and I ask myself, well, I tell myself, this is definitely not what you're supposed to do, but how do you help workers? The next stage was, well, maybe I go into law, because law is where all the rights are, right? That's where all the protection is. And that's where I confronted what Naomi brought up, which is this idea of if it's okay to be an activist in that profession. And, you know, activist judges and activist lawyers in the United States, sometimes, right, we run into this thing where, especially if you have a tendency towards critical race, right, you think, man, the law is the actual problem. If we're trying to get justice, it's the laws that have encoded these hierarchies that we're pushing against. And so I'm a lawyer, and I was actually working for the National Labor Relations Board when Hoffman Plastic came down. And I thought to myself, this law is going to exploit the labor of workers. And I thought that that's what I joined this agency to protect, right? And I started questioning, what is the role of law? What is the role of a lawyer? And I felt like while I was in law school and when I was woke up in Honduras with this lady, one of the other things I did is I was in Latin America and I took my first visit to Cuba. While I was in law school in the late 90s. And, that's a whole thing. Maybe we'll talk about Cuba some other webinar. But there's this thing about the role of a lawyer in that society, which is you are an agent of transformation. It is your job, right? And that's what, Naomi talks about, the job of justice and pursuing justice. And I just felt like, wow, I need to learn more about how societies are ordered, how industrial relations is set up, what the actors are supposed to do, what are their roles in transformation or in preventing transformation. And then I found myself at Cornell ILR because I wanted to think big. I wanted to imagine, instead of surviving, being Black and curious and being an activist scholar to survive, I wanted to be Black and curious and be an activist scholar to imagine what freedom looks like, what does equality look like, what does equity look like, right? So that's my story and my journey. So I want to thank everybody for going around in the circle. And now we're going to, be a little conversational with it, because I think that the next two questions are about, these choices are political, right? To be an activist scholar, as each of you define activist scholar, that's a political choice. And with political choices come great consequences, right? So I'd like us to sort of have a conversation about perhaps its roadblocks to becoming an activist scholar, incentives or disincentives, right? Especially in the world of academia, but you can bring an answer from any of your hats that you wear, Fila. So, I'm gonna open it up to everybody. What do you think about that choice and its consequences and impacts? Don't be shy. Go ahead.
I mean, I'll jump in. When you think about an incentive, you're rewarded for a particular behavior. And I think, frankly, you're not rewarded in academia, or at least I'll speak from the perspective of a grad student right now, but yeah, you're not rewarded, right? I think it's embedded in all of the narratives we've heard in the stories so far about, you have to be intrinsically motivated to do work from the activist scholar praxis. You have to, it's not just a curiosity. Like, I think it's like a hunger to, like, for me, it's been about my identity and and really awakening to what I think are more truths, often not good truths, right? Happy truths about our world. That drives me in a way that academia has not, but probably couldn't compensate me for. And so, if we look at the structure and the design of a thing, of an institution, right, and the purpose and how it operates and to what ends, it's not towards the end of activist scholarship or what it means to do that work. So I think just starting there at that basic premise, we can talk, right? I love to talk about, like, what would it mean to change that? Now, I think also, like, the way the world is changing, even in the last several years, has, again, for me, driven a lot of, my anchoring more in this place. I believe a lot in what it means to shift the consciousness of people, right? So I wouldn't say I have started as an activist in my work, maybe in some other way in my career. I've always been curious. I've always wanted to push to make things better, but I worked in management. I went to business school. I did all these things, but my curiosity and my hunger for understanding what was happening in the world, I guess, pushed me here. But Trump getting elected in 2016 really did a number, I would say, on me. And to be a PhD student in my first year, it like shattered a lot for me. And it really reoriented me in a way that I had to kind of find my own incentives in a way just so I could, like, survive in academia, right? So I could get emotionally fed in the work that, frankly, it wasn't doing. Like, I had to find my own topics and subjects I wanted to study in addition to the ones I was being offered. I had to go and make decisions that really, again, as a grad student, had financial repercussions for me, more money out of my pocket, because it was important for me to engage in the communities in the way that I wanted and needed to be. And frankly, just, I didn't have the time. And so I had to like make choices, right? There's trade-offs that you have to make. So I'm going to stop there because I'd love to just hear more. But I think, to really talk about incentives, you're not rewarded, right, for doing this, at least in the more the external ways that we think about what it means to get rewarded. Like, you're rewarded to publish, to work on research projects. You're not rewarded to go out in community, even to ask certain questions, right? To do this work as an activist scholar, you're often going against the grain of what is available. That means you have to read different things. You have to read, so I don't, I want to build on some of what hopefully will be said, but yeah, I think that's one way I would think about it.
Yeah, Fila, I think this concept of not being rewarded or not having incentives to do scholar activism or being an activist scholar, there's also the question of whether or not we're actually penalized for doing so, right? And so hopefully that'll come out of this discussion. Cherie, you look like you have.
Yeah. So, earlier I said something about being a scholar activist, right? And I do think it's really important to recognize that for some folks, doing certain types of scholarship, right? Like putting the time in to be in said archive, to be sitting with people, to be collecting information, to be doing the thing that they do best, knowing that it is going to create the body of literature that we need in order to move differently with a different paradigm matters, right? And for scholar activists, I feel like there is a thing of I need to move through these institutions so that I can pull levers that allow for more of this inquiry, allow for more access for more people who have not been in these institutions. Because quite frankly, when I teach my classes, I always remind my students the reason why you're important is because somebody passed away last year and some archives came out of that attic and they have now been logged somewhere. And you need to go figure out how we tell the story that we have been so completely erased from, right? And so to me, I want to be very clear that sometimes the role of the scholar activist might be heavily in the academy and figuring out those structures and how to maneuver, and that is valuable. The flip side of it is, in my opinion, is that me coming from an activist scholar perspective, I'm saying I'm coming from a Black feminist perspective. I'm coming from working for a labor union as a union rep, as a grievance and arbitrations coordinator, and kind of learning through those spaces of being with workers and seeing worker leaders, the development of worker leaders. And knowing who I'm accountable to, like I'm grounded in a particular community and I name it, I bring them into the room and I'm accountable to particular communities. And so there's a way in which I've learned to not look for my rewards within the institution, and also to think about the fact that as long as those penalties don't stop me from being able to pivot and move this way and do a thing, I'm going to keep looking for ways to open up some windows and doors for other people to get in, knowing that I don't have to be the only one, right? So when I tell people that my project is not yours, right? My project might not fully align with everything that everyone else has going on, but I know when I leave here that I want to make sure the place looks different than when I got here. Like I want to make sure that there are more people who are able to ask these kinds of questions. And so to me, there's a value system that exists, and I choose not to buy into it because I know that there's a greater thing that I'm supposed to be doing. And as long as, like, when I talk about my rewards, I feel rewarded because I'm like the board chair of the National Black Worker Centers. I can't believe that I am, but to me, that's a reward. Like I feel rewarded because I'm invited to be in spaces where people are being expansive, where people are figuring out the puzzles for transformation and taking risk. Like those are where some of the rewards come from, even when some of the folks who you feel like you're doing the thing that they want you to do, but it just doesn't seem like they engage you in the way that suggests that you are, right? Like they aren't always about like opening up doors or laying pathways, and that has to be okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in what you just said there, and I think we're going to be in a space for a minute. And I feel like, the value system, I love that you said that, because I think that academia, particularly in the United States, and I know not everyone on the call is in the United States, but we have to admit that the academy in the US is set up in a capitalist system where the incentives are for individual pursuits, right? But I remember reading, one of our ancestors, for those of us who are Black feminist folks and queer feminist folks, that, to be Black and an educator is to be radical in and of itself. What happens is we don't get to just be scholars. We are in the classroom. We have a secondary job of educators, and it is not deprioritized. And in fact, it becomes the pursuit, and sometimes is more important than whether or not we get tenure or not, right? So the kind of work we're doing, we're constantly forced to make choices, right? About, will I tell the student, right, who's crying because of DACA, which is impacting their lives directly. Do I tell them I'm not available because I have to finish this manuscript? Please go see the rest of the university resources. I will never do that. And to the extent that people tell me that I should cut down on my service work, service to students, service to the pipeline, right? The potential pipeline of scholarship, I won't do it. Will I get penalized for spending too much time in service and not enough time trying to publish or perish for my own individual reward? This is a constant tension for me. I think when you ask me theoretically, there is no tension. Of course, I'm there for the collective. I'm not getting paid for that, right? That is free labor, right? And not only free labor to the community, it's not volunteer labor for me, it is free labor for our institutions who reap the benefits of us taking on that work, taking on the activism role, right? While being incentivized or disincentivized for the scholarship route, right, value system. We're going to talk in a minute about the future or the implications of this, and I've got some ideas about solutions. But before we get there, we got Naomi and Maite. Do you want to comment on this in this space about disincentives or incentives about scholar activism?
I do and I don't. And, you know, again, when Phyllis started, right, talking about tension, I immediately went to this question in my head and listening to Sheree talking about, you know, these options. And it is true that despite all of the privileges that come with being in a tenure track position, right, my options are limited, or they could be limited. And the paths that I take to open up those options to myself and to other people cost, and they cost a lot, right? And I have to read reviews of my performance that say, right, all of this time is spent on service, where is the other work, right? And incentives in terms of, like, I have obligations to the communities that I serve. I have obligations to my department, to my school, to my university, to the profession. And while my activism drives my research and my research drives my activism, the fact that I need to publish in particular journals and with particular presses, right, closes the door to some of my activism and some of the ways that I show up in my community spaces. Because community activists are dealing with things that are on completely different timelines, right? And they're sometimes in desperate, urgent situations. And I can't respond to that with, I'll be back with you once I publish this article. Hey, just sit with me and talk to me about this so I can use your information to publish this material, right? Because that's not justice. And that's not how you show up. And that's not how we get free. And so all of that sits inside of the work that I do. And my research is very important to me. So I have collected interviews. I have life histories of people who have already died, who have served their communities for 40, 50, 60 years. And I have an obligation to tell their story and to publish the work that I'm working on, right? And while that lines up with the expectations of my department, my school, and my university, so the end is the same. The path to get there is different. And that's where the disincentives come in, right? Because if I want to get tenure, I want to be Maite one day, right? And I want to be a tenure professor. I have to do these things. But if we're all going to get free, I have to do other things as well. And so it turns into, 26-hour days. Amazingly, like how do we manage to pull all of this in and do all of this work and also protect ourselves, right? And so that's a challenge that we constantly face.
Right. Well, I'm sure Maite's been thinking about this whole time we've gone around the circle, but I want to, before Maite comes on, maybe pose an extra question for Maite. Everyone should know, Naomi, Maite, Cherie, and I are all co-editing a volume for the field of industrial relations for our academic home, LIRA, Labor and Employment Research Association. And in that journal, we actually took a turn in how these things normally are produced. And we actually asked experts who are practitioners to make contributions to our theoretical understanding of labor and employment. And so collapsing this idea of experts is a thing that we're trying to do. And Maite and I are on this campaign to sort of get academia to understand that the gatekeepers, the people who control the publications that Naomi's talking about, right? That we have to make space in some way for the kind of research that scholar activists do, or that activist scholars do, which is very applied, right? Solving real world problems, dealing with it at the front lines. And sometimes that doesn't make, or that's not as interesting or doesn't feel as heavy theoretically to our gatekeepers and our journals. And
I wanted to think, because there's something in what Naomi said too that is important around the training, right? In too many of our disciplines, we train researchers to be extractive, right? To be extractive in the service of your own scholarship. And if we're talking about critical race theory, if we're talking about intersectionality, if we're talking about praxis, we absolutely reject that. Right? You have to be in dialogue and relationship. It needs to be mutually beneficial. You have to get closer to it. And the distance, quite frankly, is the ways that people snatch, reframe, change language, empty out meaning, and then publish things that fit within a frame that somebody else created that wasn't even built for us. So it's just one of those things where I just feel like we have to caution around this thing of being extractive. And sometimes it's almost default. If you've been trained to be a researcher over years, if nobody has ever told you don't do that, it's a really hard thing to undo.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Maite, why don't we bring Maite on and to talk on this issue, and then let's put it all together.
Sure, thanks, Tammy. So I do feel like indeed as scholar activists, it's about kind of being disruptive in a way and breaking through kind of what is seen as the normal in academia. So for example, with the LIRA research volume that you mentioned, right, we're being disruptive and we're putting a radical piece together that consists not just of the traditional academic so-called academic chapters, but bringing together activists, artists, practitioners, and academics in one space and producing something that I would think is beautiful. But at the same time, we also know the reality of this, right? Everyone put a lot of work in that, but that work is not going to be rewarded in the classic kind of academic way for example, tenure, as Naomi mentioned. So that's a clear, in a way, it's a disincentive for many of us to do the work, but we do feel like we have to do it. It's important. And I come from a very privileged position in that I might not feel the same obligations to community like Naomi mentioned before, right? So in that sense, I don't have always all the students, all the service that a lot of Black women or Black scholars have, especially in our field, since there's so few. So I think that's very important. I mean, when we look at some of popular work, when they talk about how can you be the most productive, how can you get the most articles out, there's books about there that talk about how you need to do deep work, and deep work can be about you put an automatic reply on your email, you're going to write for so many days, but that's from a very privileged position, right? And I think from the stories that we hear for a lot of people, and especially Black women, that's just not the way it works. That's not how that works. So yeah, there's definitely a disincentive to do this work, and you get penalized in kind of classic academia for doing so.
Right. I mean, Maite, we might want to share some of the things we've been going through just being here in Bessemer. And for those of you who don't know, Maite and I are here in Bessemer, Alabama, with the Amazon workers are in their second election, and we're doing interviews, and we kind of have a research team meeting every morning, right? That makes us confront the ways in which we've been trained to research workers, and then what is our obligation as community partners and people who believe in justice, right? So, the ways in which we do qualitative research, if we're just trying to get publications, is one thing. How we should show up in a meeting, or how we should defer our scholarship to the workers who are taking the floor at a meeting, is something we have to actively practice. And we have to actively unlearn the ways that we've been taught to study, right, workers and movements, because we are not apart from it, looking down at it, observing it. We also are workers, right? We have to sort of understand how we should approach, how we should analyze, how we should think, who we should talk to, before we can actually put something out for publication. And it is really an active practice. And, I did not benefit from a lot of critical race training, right? I went through the industrial relations training that, the PhDs in the top IR schools go through. It doesn't have a racial lens for sure. And sometimes I think the justice lens is distorted because it's only a definition of justice that has been told to the people doing the work. And it's not fully reflecting what justice means to the folks for whom we're supposed to be studying and answering questions. And that is a really hard process to practice daily. It comes a little more inherently to me because I'm a Black person and I'm a Black woman and I'm a Black queer. And so I think about these things a lot, but when I'm working with Maite, we can see in real life, like, what the traditional way is versus what are we trying to do as activist scholars to make that research deeper, more socio-structure, have more structure to it, more tied into the oppressions of the systems that we're studying. So I really appreciate this sort of conversation and the radical nature of all of us being on a global webinar saying and critiquing the systems that bind us as professionals. And so I want to thank you all for being that brave. I don't think we have to stop this conversation. I think we should roll it into, and Cherie's already started leading us down there, roll it into like the implications, right? What happens if we didn't have activist scholars? What's the future look like without it, right? Do we need them? What do we need to do better? Those sorts of things. So we can keep talking about the incentive structures and problems, but also let's do like a call to action. What is it that we need to do in academia?
Oh, that changes it a little bit, Tammy.
Did I change it too much?
No, but just that last little clause, right? In academia.
Okay.
Kind of put a different spin on it.
Yeah, let me take that back. We do have a large academic audience. And so for those of us who are in academia and want to answer that piece too, but break it down, Naomi.
Yeah, I think Phila was going to go. Let me not interrupt Phila. And then I'll come back around. I was just like, the weight of the question changed for me when you said that. So.
Yeah, let's unpack that. Phila, go ahead.
So, yeah, I mean, I think just building on the last comments and like, what is the cost, right? Like before you even posed it, I was thinking like, so what is the cost of all of it? Like, again, I'm working on my dissertation and I'm working with folks that are organizing Black workers. And so this whole thing about extractive research. So, I mean, I guess I can say I have the benefit of not being trained too long. Like that's one thing I have going for me. But, I've come up against the challenges like right away. So one cost, right? Like it takes more time. We already know there's trade-offs. We already know more qualitative nature, but even, if you're approaching it from a quantitative standpoint or mixed methods, and you're really trying to do it in community with folks, right? It takes longer. So as a PhD student with funding for a certain amount of time, that presents a challenge. I actually get why we probably don't have as many activist scholars as we might normally have. Because the system is not designed and structured to support that, at least from an industrial labor relations standpoint. I know other fields like sociology and others, there's more space for taking longer. But I think that's, again, from a grad student perspective, but I do think some of these challenges, right, like faculty just experience them at a different level, right? But the same structural drivers in academia, I think, are there. I think, one way, the questions that you're even asking and pursuing in the first place, right, are maybe not even the right questions, right? Like what that distance from the work actually means, like to me, again, this may be more of an activist scholar like lens, but like I would really challenge and question research that is not centering the needs and issues of the workers that you're presumably focused on, right, in that work. I would question, are those even the questions, right, that should be asked in the first place? And you don't really know that until you can get in community. And that takes time. It takes a building of rapport and trust that, again, the system as it is now, I would say, doesn't allow for that. My work, and Cherie knows this, it's, to get on the radar of folks, to get their attention, and in a way that, people have are taxed with a lot of demands, right? Like, especially in communities that are faced with all the challenges and issues have just compounded on them, like Black folks, for example, right? Like, so trying to study Black folks is really hard, right? To get their attention, to get them to even care about what I'm doing. There's a distance piece I have to come in with, right? Because I'm this researcher, right? They're not going to just let me in, which they shouldn't, right? And so to me, while I haven't been trained so much in like the way of more extractive, I am stepping into a long legacy of extractive researchers from various places, not just from academia, from policy, from foundation, right? From all these places. And so that's what I'm going up against, right? As I'm trying to do research, right? And so I think that is important to name. And so, getting to solutions, I think academia needs to really, if we care enough about these things, I mean, we can talk about that, but we need to get serious about that. There are, again, I think we might have more activist scholar. I mean, I know I'm in community with my peers all the time, right? We're having these conversations, we're all facing and challenging them, but not everyone is going to respond in the same way. And I think maybe Tammy or someone said this earlier, like, as a Black woman, like there's no like choice for me, right? Like I'm not going, I have to answer these questions, right? It's that, and so I'm going to do what I have to do to get through it. But there are other more privileged folks that maybe aren't going to go this path because it really, for them, it's too hard. So I think as academia really thinks, and if we actually care about these things, if we care about the workers' issues and worker justice in the ways that we say we do, then we really need to look closely at the system we're designing, even beginning in the level of our students who are supposed to be brought up in this system. So anyway, I just wanted to add that to this conversation.
Yeah, that was a lot, actually. And I think it's coming at a lot of angles and a lot of entry points as to what we need to do, particularly in academia. But Naomi, I'm interested in what changed the question for you and why academia would have shifted it. But why don't you come through, take the stage?
part of it is in what Phila just said, right? Because for me, what's at stake is saving democracy, right? And creating a space for working people to not just live and not just survive, but to thrive, right? And to create just economies. Right? And how do we do that without centering the voice of working people? We can't, right? They actually have the answers. we need to get out of their way. And that's the problem, right? Because what we're trying to do is, and what we're saying, right? What we're saying really is we need to dismantle institutional racism in the academy so that we can save democracy. But how do you dismantle a system that you're actively in, right? And are beholden to its rules in order to stay here? And so that, like when Phila first started talking about tension, that's where this is, right? But we don't have a choice because we need new scholars to come in. We need to be relevant. Our research needs to be relevant to what's happening. The world is changing dramatically. And so we need to adapt. It's very hard for institutions to adapt, right? And we often are in these fault lines. And unfortunately, it's scholars of color, it's activist scholars, right, who continue to push at these cracks. And right, mm-hmm. we're the ones who get broken, and the system remains.
Man, I'm going to get really honest right now because, I think one thing that I'd like to tell folks is that being an activist scholar is hard. There have been times when, the things that both Phila and Naomi are talking about, where I thought, why am I trying to so hard? And tenure track is hard. Why am I trying so hard to be a member of a community that seems to be not supporting this justice-oriented, value-laden sort of goal of mine? Because my goal too, Naomi, is democracy. I might say freedom. And every time I think tenure is not worth it, I really need to be actually doing work on the ground with, like, be an activist and not an activist scholar. Like, what is it about tenure? How can I justify, rationalize this pursuit of tenure, which is an individual reward, right, in some ways? But then I get reminded by Cherie that my getting tenure is not an individual reward because I am modeling, right? I'm creating pathways for people who are going to come, the next generation, the pipeline, who is going to push academia to be more justice oriented and to incentivize and celebrate a scholar who says, I choose justice as the goal, and I'm willing to listen to the people who have the answers to it, right? So my getting tenure is not just for my individual, right, job security. It's an actual act, it's an activist act in itself to try to infiltrate that and to make space for community and to actually bring community into the room, right?
Ooh, Tammy, can I just tell you that until you can name 5 Black women with tenure in this field easily, at least, I can't even hear it, right? I can't even hear it, right? Because we are talking about like serious absence. And I will tell you, coming into labor and in the labor movement, like I went to Spelman and I felt whole in a particular way in my women's studies department under Dr. Beverly Gottschalk. That doesn't mean that I was like, oh, me and Black women, everything is perfect. It does not mean that. But Ohio State, hard. Emory University, hard. The AFL-CIO, hard. But working for a Justice for Janitors local, that made sense to me, right? Like, so there are certain places where you can be expansive. You can see some of the things that where people are we would consider them to be ordinary folks that are doing extraordinary things, but they're not on a path to being a tenured labor scholar, right? And quite frankly, clearly, we're not even, I come from a UAW household. The only reason why I went to college is because my dad was union, right? Did I know anything about unions when I was in undergrad? No. Did I know anything about them? I didn't know until that labor strike on my campus. And when my dad's calling like, oh my gosh, this is dangerous. You're on a picket line. And I'm out there in heels and a sundress on a picket line, just like, we fighting the power, and a truck is trying to drive through me because it's real. But the problem is there's so many people who are just like me, who come out of labor households that only get to go to college because of these union households. And then we don't even talk to them. We're not even engaging them. They can't even see us. And they can't even, give me a scan of how many classes in labor studies focus on Black workers, focus on immigrant workers, quite frankly, focus on queer workers, focus on marginalized folks. We've had clearly that gender kind of reckoning happen, but it was really white women. And you can tell from coming to Lyra. And so my question is how long is labor studies gonna wait? Because if you look at what's happening with labor in the country, they have to see us. They have to see us to even know, that's a destination. That's a place I can go. And we have to be speaking the language that they're going to even be able to hear. And so we need to make sure that there are folks that they're going to see and hear, that they're like, yes, that makes sense to me. You are speaking in the terms that I can understand. And yes, that's a movement for me. Yes, this is a place for me. That matters. It really does.
Yeah. I mean, in case y'all didn't know, Cherie is an activist scholar. They talk a certain kind of way, and they bring a kind of energy that always has a call to action. I know we're running short on time, and I know we've got a ton of questions, but I want to make sure that Maite, that you have at least a moment to sort of reflect on implications, and then maybe Kate wants to come on with Q&A. Maite, why don't you take the stage?
I mean, given the limited time, let's just go to the questions. This was all
Okay.
great. You can move over me. Yeah.
Okay, Kate.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be part of this panel and to share this space with you. I'm currently a professor of labor and employment law at Cornell's ILR school, and I've been doing this for the last 15 years. But before I entered academia full-time, I was an attorney representing low-wage and immigrant workers, mostly in wage and hour lawsuits. And so I've just had some of these struggles and conversations for years within myself. And so I'm just really appreciating hearing all your perspectives. So we have great questions, but I will start us off with one of my own, and then I'll turn to some of the excellent questions we got from the audience. And I'm glad you all invoked the Lyra volume, because I was going to do that. And I want to share the title because it's an excellent title, and then I'll let you know my question about it. So it's A Racial Reckoning in Industrial Relations, Storytelling as Revolution from Within. And I know Tammy mentioned a lot of you are involved in putting this volume together, but I wanted you to talk more about storytelling as an approach. And I know you're already kind of showing it to us and talking about it, but if you could talk about it even more, and to the extent with which you think it kind of helps bridge that the sort of division between the academic and activist and other roles that you think storytelling plays, that would be really great.
All right, Cherie, you're our... Oh.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, Naomi. Cherie is always the person we go to describe storytelling.
Look, I think the thing that I benefit from having been exposed to critical race theory very, very early. And the thing that I always learn is that you start with the story. You start with the story. And if you're actually really listening, and then you put that story into the historical context of the person who's telling the story, right? The community that the story comes from. And then you look at the political context around that. in order to come to your understanding, your synthesis, not the paradigms that we're offering or the filters that we might have had, but really honestly listening. The thing is that you'll actually hear problems that you didn't even think were the problems, right? And it'll set you on a different path. And so I do think that, you know, when we trust starting with the stories and really hearing from folks who may not have had voice and nobody's even asked them, right? It really changes the role that we play, and it allows us to be able to see greater possibilities than some of the narrow and restrictive and exclusive kind of paradigms that existed that, again, were not built for many of us.
Right, or to have those stories, right, manipulated in ways that to fit into, right, these academic publications. And so if you're doing a qualitative study and you're getting these responses and you make a decision that the responses that you're getting aren't valid, right? And you put a different frame on those questions, or the answers, the responses to those questions, that is taking away people's agency, right? And in history, right, history is about the narrative, but the way we tell stories matter. And I was very fortunate very early in my education to have, you know, activist scholars as professors who came from a place of economic and racial justice and saying, we cannot, you know, this is how you do history wrong and this is how you do history right. And I think, you know, I'm very, very excited about the historians who have agreed to participate in the volume, and the fact that, like, they do this work, but they never imagine themselves as being part of an academic organization, employment relations, right? And so many of the people who are participating in the journal, right, do this work, right? Answer the questions that industrial relations scholars say that they are answering in different spaces. And so the opportunity to bring those voices into the LYRA organization is so important.
Yeah, I just want to add, you know, Maite and I we'd written a paper in the ILR review where we called for industrial relations academy to provide theoretical reparations. And storytelling is a methodology for reparative justice for all the voices that we might have erased intentionally or unintentionally by not centering storytelling in the voice of the workers and the identities that are most salient to them. So I think of storytelling as a methodology, but also as a tool of reparative justice.
And I would just add very briefly that it's kind of, again, breaking through the traditional way also that in which we write these academic papers. So the LYRA volume has some of the chapters that will look very different than what we're used to. And that is because they're done through storytelling rather than this kind of very systematic kind of intro literature review, etc. And even just in a practical way. In fact, Tammy and I were just talking about that, I think 2 hours before this seminar. The way I've been trained to do my qualitative research is to set up a very structured or semi-structured kind of interview protocol and kind of follow line by line the questions when we talk to workers, union representatives, etc. And that's a very different way, just in a practical sense, from thinking about kind of the element of storytelling and letting the workers go through their own histories, narratives, etc. So sometimes in the beginning, when Tammy and I worked together, I was there with my list, like, did we ask this question already? So I had to learn that's not a good way of conducting research, and in fact you erase a lot of the narrative that you would have by going through this kind of storytelling.
I just want to take a quick minute and say, Maite, thank you. I have so much respect for you and so much respect for the ways that you allow yourself to be uncomfortable and to do this work. I'm serious. You have the opportunity to not do that. But instead, you put yourself in uncomfortable situations in order to do this work. And I have so much respect for that. Thank you, Maite.
Look, can I jump on that too? Because I also just want to acknowledge like the piece that you and Salil Sampra, and I hope I'm saying his last name right, that you all write is such a reframe, specifically because you are asking people to come in from a different door completely, right? Like you are asking them to actually enter through from a place of thinking about race, putting race forward, centering that kind of history and narrative of how businesses, workers, communities might come together around a thing, and to say, why is this not a labor struggle? Like asking that question, but you're sitting it where it is. It's one of those things, like to see that dialogue that you all have done and that you have been in dialogue with Tammy for so long. Most people don't do dialogic work, and quite frankly, having tenure, you don't have to. Right? Like you could choose to go a different way, but there is something to be said about being intentional about being in dialogue for the growth of it. And I just really both want to acknowledge the methodology that, quite frankly, I've learned from you and Tammy is possible to be co-writers and co-thinkers and co-creators, because I actually think that's a model that more people should pick up on. Instead of some of the ways that sometimes it's like, and mine will be the lead name, even though maybe you did all the research over here. Like there's some interesting stuff in academia around whose name and how this thing shows up that doesn't feel dialogic. I'm just going to say that.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to seeing this volume. Could you share when it's coming out so we can keep our eyes on it for next year?
So it's in production now, actually. So it'll probably come out, I'm assuming, later on in 2022.
Great. And Fila, I know you're trying to write your dissertation, so you're not as directly involved with the volume itself, but if you could speak to storytelling and the role that plays in your work, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I should share this, and maybe I know Tammy's on my committee, but I remember a time ago, Cherie said to me, Cherie's been a bad influence, but she was like, you might have to make up your own methods, and I'm not saying that I, have done that. Obviously, I've had to draw on and rely on literature to help me think about the methods I'm using in my research, but I want to name or call that out because I got to a point where I instinctively didn't feel like what the training I'd had or like what had been told I was supposed to do wasn't what made sense for understanding the work I was trying to do. And so for me and my work, the stories of the workers are like, that's like central to it's framing the entire approach. It's framing the questions. I mean, everyone knows in research, you sort of refine and refine and refine the more you learn. For me, it's meant centering the stories and actually like taking myself. I mean, I think this goes also back to like the trade-offs and the tensions. I've had to take myself and my needs to somewhat like off center a bit to be able to even get the work done. And I think that's, again, an important part of this idea of what it means to be accountable. Because the stories that I'm being told in the work are really driving the research and the agenda that I'm on in my dissertation, and in a way that I don't think I had expected at the start. But it feels like what the work should be. So again, I'm going back to this point about like, is our work doing what we say we want it to do? Does it have the value, the relevance, and all these things if we're not approaching it from the view that the workers and their stories should be centered and driving the narratives? So anyway, that's what I would offer.
Thank you. And for our next question, I'm going to collect some and then have you respond. A number of the questions center around universities and what they could do better. You've all spoken to some of the barriers and the tensions. what could universities do to actually support the activist scholarship? And our UK colleague shares that actually there are incentives there to your research excellence, and some funding is tied to showing that you have an impact beyond the academy. It actually helps you gain funding. And I'm sure there are some models where promotions can assess these things or consider them rather than ignore them. So you don't have to speak to those particular ideas, but they're in some of the comments and questions. But if all of you could talk about what universities could do better, that would be our next set of questions.
I'll just say briefly, since I'm on the second leg of tenure track, one of the things they make you do, of course, to get promotion is to submit a personal statement and a package, right? Supporting package. And they want you to break up. They want you to extract, right? These three areas, right? Where you're teaching, well, your research is most important, right? And then your teaching, and then your service. And there's an algorithm, right? I think the universities have to understand that when they're dealing with a diverse faculty, that first of all, those things were not easily extrapolated, right? We can't pull those. My teaching is informed and influenced by my research, which is informed by my service. And to force me to prove to them that I have accomplished their algorithm in a way that doesn't fit my body, doesn't fit my experience, doesn't fit what they have me teaching students in class, just seems, like something that is easily done. What usually happens is the institutions say, we can't change it. That's how tenure is. It's been that way forever. But then we see something like COVID happen, and all of a sudden they can do a whole lot of things, right? It's about the political will. And the universities can't hide with what Cherie and I are, I'm afraid to say it because we're going to write a paper about it, performative powerlessness. This idea is that universities can't change the algorithm to encourage and incentivize, first of all, people's existence as activist scholars, but to create them like Maite, who may not have had, who could opt in, right? The universities control, they are the gatekeepers, right? So I want them to actually stop performing powerlessness and actually make the institutional changes that are necessary to celebrate and honor and reward the kind of work that we're doing.
Can I also just add that I think it's important that oftentimes people go through kind of the diversity, equity, inclusion pathway, right? And they usually get to phase one, which is diversify. Somewhat. First and foremost, I always say that I don't want to talk about inclusion until we talk about the exclusionary practices and policies that got us here, right? If we can't have that conversation, then none of this other stuff is going to work. But that actually is part of the reason why we can get to the diversification part kind of, but then we're not doing the next step where you bring in the people that you actually brought in to who were not part of how things have been built. You're not bringing them together in committee to say, tell me what your experience has been getting to this point. Tell me what the barriers have been to you getting to this point. Tell me what would have been helpful for you and what you think might be helpful for those coming behind you. And let's have a conversation about how we invest real resources, time, and serious attention into creating something that's different. And that means removing some of the barriers that are in the way, actually bringing resources to the imaginings that you have for this field that you have not been invited to or a part of for a very long time. What do you see as possible? Why are you choosing to be here when so many others are studying labor in every place else but here when they look like you, right? So asking that question and meaning it for the purposes of building with the understanding that the reason why we use storytelling is because we need to bring a counter narrative, and we're rooted in that. And I speak openly about being oppositional. It is not about being rude. It's about being able to be honest and say, if this thing were already working, we would have been multiracial a long time ago, right? So how then do we actually put the thing in place that we say we want, and people can actually see the investment in it? Not just the investment in people, but the investment in different policies, procedures, and structures, and make connections as opposed to kind of restricting, right, what you're able to do.
And I'll just add, I want to add something concrete that I find really frustrating, right? So, in the United States, part of how you get tenure, right, is that you have top people in your field write letters saying that you are a scholar who deserves tenure, right? And so if these scholars, you're going to respect the words of these scholars to say, okay, yes, move this person on to tenure, then you need to question what criteria are they using to judge? And you actually need to shape it. So if you want your faculty to look different, right, and you want your faculty to do different work, you need to let your letter writers know that that's what you're looking for. And then you need to acknowledge it when it goes through the whole process, right? Because the department, the school, and the university level, there are all of these different levels at play here. And if that work isn't valued at all of those levels, then that's where people get stuck. Right. And that's an excuse. That's an excuse to continue to block this path to tenure. And that's something that we can't, I have no role in that. Right. I'm going to be in a couple of years asking people to write letters for me. And knowing that most of those people, don't respect. Go ahead, Phila.
No, I just I obviously not on tenure track. I need to get out of this thing in the first place. But I did want to say something that I think for me has been really important in my whole activist scholar. I told myself I wasn't going to wait till I had a PhD to make impact. I wasn't going to wait for that permission. And I tell that a lot to my colleagues who are in programs now, they're postdoc or right. And I see how I'm moving and navigating differently. I've made certain choices about how I'm going to spend my time, for better or for worse, when it comes to my doctoral pursuits. But it's because that was so important to me, because I knew I had something of value to offer now to the world. And I actually cannot wait until I have a paper in my hand. I can name a number of impacts I've made over the last several years to work that's been happening outside of academia and have nothing to do with things I published. And so I think that's an important piece about this criteria that we need to rethink. And so, yeah, I wanted to just say that because for me, I think that's what drives a lot of this is I wasn't going to wait for permission.
And Maite, do you have any thoughts on this question of what universities can do? And then I'll close us out.
I mean, those were all really valid points. And to me, it's when I just think about just very practically about, the next kind of people coming up for tenure that are also on this panel. And if I could think about what could potentially happen, I feel like I got to go on strike, so we got to, yeah, I mean, who would be the tenure letter writers, right? There's no senior Black scholar within our kind of classic IR schools, really. There's no one that can relate to these experiences, to what we all just talked about. So how are people supposed to move through this kind of very white-dominated structure that is set up to preserve these privileges? So I think we will need some radical action if it comes down to it.
Yeah, and I just want to underscore something Naomi said about what are we asking them to comment on and what does impact look like, and expanding that notion, right? That would be a radical shift from the way it's structured now and would honor some of this work. So I want to thank the panelists, Tammy, Cherie, Maite, Phila, and Naomi. for taking the time out this afternoon, this evening, and for sharing your stories. It's been an amazing conversation. I want to thank those of you who are watching for participating and sending in these excellent questions. Our panelists were answering as you were going through, and they really helped to move the conversation along. And I just want to note that there are some links that have been put up about different opportunities for people interested in labor and labor relations, early career, and students. So take a look at those if you're someone who's in that position and might be looking for how do I get into something like this and how can I find opportunities. So with that, have a great evening or afternoon, depending on your time zone. Thank you.